Welcome back to History of Graphic Narratives. Today we're going to talk about William Hogarth, who was a modestly successful artist during his lifetime, but not as he had hoped as a painter of great works, but as a caricaturist, a term or an idea that he really loathed. In any case, he has a fascinating art and was extraordinarily influential in the progress of the history of graphic narratives. William Hogarth was trained as an engraver, and he was sort of self-taught as a painter. His engravings at the time were part of what was sort of popularly done, humorous, satirical, political, social commentary. People would buy these prints if they especially agreed with the sentiments encased in them. Hogarth, in one of his early works here, you see him sort of parroting British tastes for European entertainments. And he said, what about the great Shakespeare? And so he was very much a British man who loved all things British. And he found the typical tastes of most of his countrymen, which longed for the exotic foreign arts of the continent, something to be desired. So you notice here, he's actually using phylactery. His characters are in these speech bubbles in his early work. He very quickly sort of abandoned this practice in his later, more mature work and a more pictographic storytelling. This was a series of pictures he did that illustrated a popular story called Hudibras, Sally's Fourth, a kind of parody based on the story of Don Quixote. And this series of images, Hogarth developed a very rich pictorial vocabulary, and he loved to represent things as they are happening. As you see this man stepping back to bow to what he imagines to be this great lord on horseback, and as he's backs up, he bumps over this table of goods and spills them onto the floor. And we see the moment of the spill. And this is the thing that Hogarth loved to do, was to create the sense we're seeing this richly realized moment. The thing that actually Hogarth became most famous for were a series of stories he created, made entirely of pictures. In these stories, he told an original tale. The first one came out in 1732 called A Harlots Progress. In it, we see this young girl from the countryside who has arrived by wagon to seek her fortune. She's awaiting for her sister-in-law, but she has failed to come. And we see her bags there in the foreground. And we see instead she's been met by this madam of a brothel who will lure her inside. The men standing in the doorway, one fondling himself, looking and ogling at this young virgin girl who's arriving from the countryside to be swept into this place of prostitution. And so this is the start of this story. And the story is sort of told through the sort of gestures and actions and postures of the events going on. It's a richly realized symbolic story that is a kind of pantomime or tableau of the events. What made this so interesting was how these stories played out over time. There was a kind of causality. We see that this young girl taken into the brothel becomes a very famous prostitute with high-end clientele, and then we see her becoming impetuous, and then losing her fame, and then finally being thrown in debtor's prison. And here we find her life turns out for the worse as she and further into destitution and illness and finally death. Who is to blame for this? Maybe the girl, but certainly society. And this is what makes this such an interesting visual tale. Hogarth creates a sort of rich tapestry of social actions and interactions that we can sort of pore over as we look at all the evidence before us. He wanted us to recognize that it was actually the people around her that should have been looking out for her, that should have been the structures of society that should prevent young girls from the countryside from being taken in this manner. And so this is something that was rather a scandalous idea. It was an original story told in picture that had a kind of causality to it that we could make sense of. And no one had ever done this before in Europe. And so we have this very unique kind of narrative, which I would like to call this sort of consequential narrative. There's a consequence actions that are taking places that link together to create a moral tale. And this is what Hogarth actually called them, his moral stories, his moral histories. All of this dealt with this new law that had come out 20 years earlier, which is called the copyright law. The Statute of Anne was its original name. And he argued that this new law, copyright, that really only pertained to words, the printed word, should also pertain to printed pictures. And so in 1735, he passed with great fanfare the Hogarths Act, as it became known, which is an extension of copyright law to protect both words and pictures. And this was this idea that for a limited time, and at this point it was 14 years, the works would be the sole provenance of the right to protect his work, that he alone could reproduce them. No one could take them until he had earned some compensation for his original work. At that point, his works would go into what was called then the public domain. And many people did continue to copy them after him. And so we have this next story. He comes out right away on the heels of his Copyright Act. This is the Rake's Progress. Now the man has fallen into dissolution and insanity from being profligate and spending away his inheritance. This proved again a very popular story, and Hogarth was soon very wealthy and very influential. Hogarth worked on his in a very interesting way. He began by making paintings. This is scene 2 of 6 of a series called Marriage a la Mode. Many of the original paintings of the earlier series are now lost, but we do have this Marriage a la Mode, talking about two young upper middle class kids who have inherited a lot of money, and they've made this marriage of convenience, and both are kind of going off and whoring and drinking and gambling. And their tax collector has sort of thrown up their bookkeeper has sort of thrown up his hands and is walking away in disgust. So here we see the original painting, but from this painting he would then create his engravings, and he would then have a exhibition of the paintings. The people would come and look at the paintings, and then after, he would pay admission to go see this exhibition. And then if they liked the story, they would buy a set of prints, and this proved to be very beneficial. Now Hogarth hoped to sell his paintings, but he'd never had much luck of this during his lifetime, and he certainly never got as much money he had hoped for. So the painting is about 27.5 by 35.5 inches, and the engravings are a little smaller, 17 inches by 13.5 inches. And you can see how he's kind of flipped the image. The image is flipped because when he's engraving, he's copying it directly, and then when it prints, it's reversed. Now, what I find really fascinating about this is, to me, the picture makes more sense as an engraving. The way the story reads from left to right makes more sense as an engraving. So I wonder, did he reverse his initial idea for the painting in his mind, anticipating what the print would look like in the end? The other thing we need to recognize is where Hogarth is coming from. His idea about painting was extremely novel and original. It was based on a classical idea of painting called the history painting, which is usually a classic subject, something like the rape of the Sabines women. And this story would then be depicted in sort of classical dress in an idyllic landscape. And it would represent the sort of high ideal of painting at this time. So Hogarth, by setting his paintings in contemporary world with people wearing contemporary clothes, dealing with contemporary issues, was really quite radical. The nearest contemporary that could be similar to this idea was really several years off. And this was Benjamin West, who took this idea of the history painting and applied it to sort of historic events, grand narratives. And you can see people, even though they're dressed in contemporary clothing, they're all sort of posing like Greek statues. And that was sort of the idea, that history painting had to be this kind of lofty and serious subject. And so for Hogarth's work, his work was often thought of as sort of a caricature. And I think that's the reason why people never took his paintings that seriously. It wasn't a lofty enough subject. To try and burnish his street cred with the elites and show that he was a man of learning, William Hogarth published a book called The Analysis of Beauty, wherein he outlined his ideas about art and beauty and design, and he connected his work with the ancients, showing how these curvilinear lines in classic work were an important component of making beautiful and enriching pictures. It's unfortunate he didn't talk about his real innovations, which was how he told stories, but he's very serious about this idea of creating a beautiful image, an image which is compelling in its elegance and its complexity. And he sort of pointed out how these sort of crude caricatures that lack that sense of grace and beauty are not effective. Hogarth's book was a bit of a failure. No one took him very seriously, and he got involved in some political issues that turned out to be ill-advised. And so, toward the end, his reputation in ruins. He was still fairly wealthy, but if this last picture he ever published is any indication of his personal mood about his fame and fortune, we can see everything he sees is in ruin. He calls this the bathos. Utter destruction and dissolution is everywhere. And it's unfortunate because Hogarth's legacy would be very significant, but not during his lifetime, and certainly not for many decades afterwards. In fact, it would be almost 100 years before someone would kind of pick up this kind of storytelling and begin to do the kind of thing that he was so good at. An original story with pictures. Here from 1847, George Cruikshank, very famous illustrator and satirical printmaker, had put on a story about temperance. Alcoholism was rampant in London among the lower classes and upper classes, and it was a poisonous society that George Cruikshank wanted to highlight. And so we see the drunkard father drinking up all of the wealth of the family, leaving everyone into poverty. And this was sort of this sort of moral tale in a series of pictures that he sold. In this case here, Cruikshank felt he needed to sort of put the text to the images to make it abundantly clear what his story is about. So we see the starved cat and the children there, concerned and scared with their father as the mother is pawning their goods to bring him some drink. This proved very popular, and Cruikshank came back with a second tale now of the children growing up in poverty and resorting to crime and prostitution, and then finding themselves destitute and alcoholics themselves. And the final image of the series is this here, plate number 8, where the woman, now homeless, friendless, deserted, destitute, and gin-mad, commits self-murder. There's something so impossibly hopeless about this image. She is so completely out of reach, and she plummets to her death. And this is something that's also very different about Cruikshank and Hogarth. Hogarth's messages were ambivalent. The question he put back to us was, who was really to blame? Under Cruikshank, the moral is very clear. Alcohol needs to be banned. And this was the kind of sort of heavy-handed moralism that Cruikshank employed to sell his pictures.